Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Mike Green of the United States Studies Center in Sydney and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Mike Green, and I'm joined by a distinguished American diplomat and friend of many decades, I think I'm allowed to say, Ambassador Laura Stone. Laura is Senior Advisor at DGA Albright Stonebridge Group and is about to head to Stanford for an exciting chapter teaching about U.S.-China relations in Asia. She served most recently in government as the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and she's also been the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for China and Mongolia, the DAS for India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and she's had key positions on trade, investment, policy throughout her career in the State Department. So, Laura, great to have you. We'll talk Marshall Islands, but we'll also talk China and strategy and State Department.
Sounds great.
Let's start with you. When we first met, you had one foot in academia and you had one foot in the State Department. You were working in INR. And I remember I was in a similar place. A lot of us were trying to decide what to do. You went down the diplomatic route.
I did.
Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. So at the time I was studying a lot about how these emerging economic states, essentially in Asia, were affecting geopolitics. And I had no idea then that I was hitting such fertile ground because these were in many ways very, very nascent, very emerging states. And they were developing very rapidly, but I don't think anyone expected what has happened. And particularly, no one has expected what's really happened with China. I started out doing Japan, and I really had this fundamental idea, which I think was being tested at the time, that their economics was going to lead to stability, to democratization, to all these, wonderful things that were going to happen, that were going to take over Asia. At the time, it was an emerging Japan and a Japan that could say no. So this was the late 80s, early 90s. And what ended up happening was that I ended up gradually shifting in those early years over from doing Japan to doing China, because China at the time, there were many questions about whether China was, in fact, a real destabilizer on an economic front in the region. There was a lot less concern about it as a geopolitical force, but the Asian financial crisis had just ripped through the region. Things were collapsing, and it really looked like some of the Chinese banking system and possibly the Chinese economy was going to collapse as well. And at the same time, we'd just come out of Tiananmen, which at least in part, had been inspired by some hyperinflation and a Chinese unwillingness to do some of the reforms that it needed to do. And that's why we were looking at things like integrating China into the global economic system. Now, obviously, that has not proved to be an incredibly stabilizing effort. In fact, it's rather had the opposite. But it was kind of where I started. And then it was early enough that my brain was spongy enough that I could learn Chinese still. And so ended up really spending most of my career working either on China or on issues related to China. It was really great time to be coming into the field in some ways, although at the time it felt like chaos. And we all felt that the Clinton administration and senior people were making all kinds of mistakes about China and Japan. And Kurt Tong, who is just new to the State Department, and David Asher and Kurt Campbell, and we all sort of thought we'd figured it out. But the prevailing mood at the time was that Japan was on this inexorable rise and China was weak. The guys who taught me Japan, they came up in an era when our main concern was Japan was too weak. And then by the early 90s, we thought Japan was too strong. And in the 80s and in the 70s, we thought China was too weak. And now we think China's too strong. Are we ever happy? Are American foreign policymakers ever happy? Well, it's more like we have this inherent arrogance that we can somehow put our hand on the tiller and drive these really strong geopolitical currents in a way that maybe we have a little less influence over than we thought. But actually, to get back to your original question, why did I go into foreign policy as opposed to academia? I think I really did want to have an immediate impact on what I was doing. I really enjoyed sitting around and thinking deep thoughts. And I think that's often been one of the criticisms that folks have about me, is I sit back and I try to really think and really test the assumptions that we're working on. But at the same time, I wanted to be there on the front lines. I wanted to be in the negotiating room as opposed to studying the people that were in the negotiating room. And so it's been a great career. I mean, I've absolutely loved it. I can't think of a better life, and I can't think of a better way to have spent decades serving the American people and really trying to figure these systems out. But it turns out that they move in ways that are very unpredictable. And I think you have to maintain a certain amount of humility about how much impact you can actually have and how predictable it is.
You went from kind of the epicenter of geopolitics, which is China policy, to, I don't want to say the periphery, because the Pacific Islands are actually in their own way right now, the epicenter of geopolitical competition. But, you went from Washington, I guess, to Stanford for a stint before going to the Marshall Islands. And the islands have as I've written in some of my histories, the islands have a very, very deep and important thread in American strategic thinking, going back to the early 19th century, to Alfred Thayer Mahan at the end of the 19th century, to post-war strategic planning. The Forrestal and the post-war planners during World War II were obsessed with the Northern Marianas and the island chain, because we are on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, and the island chain was almost like a picket fence to defend our interests, or a staging area, as the Japanese used it, to attack our interests. So it comes in and out of focus, but it has a long history of being a core part of American strategic thinking. Mm-hmm. So that said, very few people study the Marshall Islands in graduate school. I'm guessing at Cornell and Oxford, you didn't. I didn't. I ended up in the White House working on the compact renegotiation and spending a lot of quality time with Ambassador Danny DeBrum and the Marshallese. But just for those who don't follow Pacific Island intrigue and geopolitics and diplomacy, tell us a bit about the Marshall Islands, why they matter to the U.S., and then we'll broaden it to the broader region.
Sure. It's a really interesting place. One of the things you really have to understand about the whole Pacific, and the Marshall Islands is one example of this, is just the sheer size, the amount of the globe that it takes up. And so just to put it into something that maybe people can get an idea of, the EEZ of the Marshall Islands, so the water that it in theory controls, is about the size of a U.S. time zone. And so the stretching from Florida up to Maine, and that width out to Chicago from Washington, D.C., it's huge. And the land mass is about the size of Washington, D.C., scattered all through that. And so it makes for some very unusual geostrategic and prioritizing issues, because really what you're trying to do is you're trying to cover space. And physically where it is, there's a reason that the island hopping campaign went through these, where the island chains, the first island chain, the second island chain, those run parallel to, for example, the coast of China or the coast of Asia. What the COFA states are, the Compact of Free Association states, they are more like a highway through from the west coast of the United States through to Asia. And so if the first island chain is the picket fence, then the COFA states and the northern Pacific states are the highway through. And so that's just an easy way of saying the geostrategic importance of what these countries are. They just take up a really large amount of space on the globe, and they happen to be stuck in between the United States and Asia. And so it becomes very important for that. The reason I think that Australia focuses a little more on, for example, the Papua New Guinea and the Melanesian states. So these are the states that are just north and northeast of Australia, is again because those are the barriers, the states that are between Australia and everyone else if you're going in the northeast direction. And for New Zealand, they really focus on the Polynesian states. These are the countries like Fiji that, again, stretch through the sea lanes that allow New Zealand to have access. But it's much, much more than geostrategery. These are really long-standing relationships. I cannot tell you how wonderful it was to live there. It's just spectacular. The views are amazing. You're seeing dolphins swimming and leaping outside of my office window from the embassy. My house looked out over the lagoon. But the people are just wonderful. They have the really intense love of family, a very deep commitment to spirituality and to religion. They have managed to maintain a lot of their culture despite development, and they're living in really tough places. So they're spectacularly important. I do want to very quickly mention the COFA states, the Compact of Free Association states. They're very different than the rest of the Pacific. The United States basically ran them during the UN Trusted Territory days after World War II. And they gradually voted for, rather than a complete independence, they're independent and sovereign states, but they have ceded their military and security to the United States. And the United States recognized its responsibility to these countries, and that we have this incredibly special relationship. It's actually in many ways closer than an alliance. The United States has full responsibility for their security. And because of these historical ties, we have a lot of responsibility towards treating them almost like we do Guam or like we do the Marianas. We have a lot of involvement in their development. But then also the people who live in the COFA states have the ability to go to the United States to work, to study, and to live without visas and as a completely free flow. And the United States citizens can go live there as well.
I was told, tell me if I'm wrong, at one point, the per capita, the Marshall Islands had the highest participation in the U.S. Army of any state or territory of the U.S. I don't know if that's still true. Also, places like Arkansas and the chicken industry, there's this huge diaspora of Marshallese. So it's really quite deep connections.
Yeah, they're very deep and they're very proud of that connection. It's kind of a mixed relationship. So their view of the United States is very positive. The United States view of the COFA states is very positive. It's a great relationship, but there's some historical legacies that are pretty confusing and really do need to be addressed. So we did a lot of that. Bikini is in the Bikini Atoll is in the Marshall Islands. And we did a lot of our testing. Some of that testing led to fallout on some neighboring atolls. It's a historical legacy that they really do feel like needs to be addressed. There's a constant need for the United States to acknowledge the sacrifices the people of the Marshall Islands made. They didn't have a choice in this. They were basically used as a test site. And we still have a base there. It's a very important base. It's an important testing base, but it's also where you can look at our space fence. And these are geostrategically essential facilities.
Are you talking about Kwajalein?
Kwajalein Atoll. So Kwajalein Atoll is where the U.S. Army garrison Kwajalein Atoll is located. So it's got a lot of the testing there, but it's also got a lot of other facilities. And frankly, it's easier to go look on Google because I think sometimes you can get a better view of the facilities there in that kind of public space on Wikipedia than I could say in an unclassified environment. But it's really important stuff. And it has to do with the fact that the way geopositioned satellites are launched, you can look at the patterns, and this is all unclassified information, but the patterns that would, for example, launch from, if I was going to pick some places, Kazakhstan and central China and North Korea, just the way they launch, you would tend to go over a little spot in the middle of the Pacific as your first look. And so those kinds of things become very important.
The diplomacy in the Pacific is so different. Joel Ehrenreich, who was ambassador in Palau, baseball crazy country because of Japan and then American influence. And of course, Joel I think he was a professional or at least trained as a umpire. And so baseball just connects Palau. Maybe that's true for Marshall Islands. Mm-hmm. Prime Minister Albanese of Australia signed a landmark treaty agreement with Fiji. The core element that locks Fiji in is having a Fijian team in the Australian Rugby League.
Yep.
In a lot of Polynesia and Melanesia churches, and I think probably Northern Mariana as well, church influence is very, very important.
Very important.
Church-wise. So it's baseball up north, it's rugby down south, it's churches all across the region, it's connections and family deep into Hawaii and South Island of New Zealand and Sydney and Melbourne and Adelaide. And so there's an awful lot of connectivity that I gather diplomats just keep reinforcing. But China's influence across the whole Pacific, including in the COFA states, is really growing, isn't it? I mean, China was actively, I am told, counteroffering more money to undercut our negotiation of this agreement where we provide security and economic support. And then China was actively saying, we'll give you more money. In Palau, we'll build a giant resort where that American base is going to go, really quite active. Did you see that in the Marshalls? Did you see it across the region? How would you assess that knife fight, that game right now?
So it's startling, the amount of Chinese investment and business that goes on in the Pacific Islands. It's everything from a little mom and pop grocery store selling single cigarettes out of a back window to large scale hotels, resorts, and fishing operations. The investment in these places is pretty much Chinese. And it varies, but it's like you've never seen. It would be like if you walk down a small town in the United States and every business was somehow connected to China. Now, there's a legacy there. A lot of these businesses were originally from Taiwan. And it's worth mentioning that another very important part of the relationship and the importance of the PICs, the Pacific Island countries, is that 3 of the remaining countries that recognize Taiwan still exist in the Pacific Islands. So that's Palau, Republic of Marshall Islands, and Tuvalu. They are strong partners, but there's this constant desire to undermine them. So China is interested in undermining Taiwan's space. Taiwan still, as a partner, is allowed to, in theory, participate in the Pacific Island Forum and some of the other Pacific forums because they are recognized by three of the members. But China is constantly trying to undermine them. This caused a big kerfuffle. Well, not a kerfluffle, but a real diplomatic incident last year in which the Solomon Islands ended up just not inviting any of the partners. It was great that Australia could still be there as a member, but we really got a setback there. The Chinese are really interested in just this geostrategic. They're interested in the fishing rights. They're interested in the mining rights, the deep sea mining. And then they're interested in these strategic bases and just the ability to stymie United States efforts to either see or counter what China's doing. So yeah, it's everywhere. It's on the political side, it's on the economic side, but it's also not all of it is driven, I think, by Beijing. I think a lot of it is just driven by China's a really important economic influence in the region and has spilled out into the Pacific. It's very hard to counter. And if I had to pick an area where I feel that the United States and its partners are maybe not doing as much as they could, is figuring out how to push private industry into these Pacific Islands because they're poor places and they're desperate for investment.
There's a bunch of stuff in there I want to unpack. I'm trying to think of the best way to do it because this is the great game. I mean, You described it as a highway. Secretary of State Stewart in the 1860s described it as stepping stones to the Pacific, a phrase that the U.S. Navy had used in the 1840s. I mean, you look at the history of warfare and diplomacy, and people forget this. We almost went to war with Japan over the island of Yap, where there was in the 1920s about undersea cables. That's back. The Japanese strategy, Admiral Yamamoto's strategy, was to dominate Melanesia. Japan already had much of the German former colonies under the League of Nations trustee program. But the strategy was to go through the Solomons and basically cut off Australia from U.S. reinforcements. The Japanese knew that we were going to have to fight our way up from Australia and then sort of from Hawaii, but Hawaii alone wouldn't be enough of a base. So the geography is critical. It's denial. It's preventing the U.S. from reinforcing, but also it's power projection. I mean, the Japanese attacks in World War II came from.
Yeah.
Many of the staging of the Japanese carriers and fleet was in these islands. And so it's all taught in the PLA war colleges, I'm sure. Probably not taught enough in ours. So and that's what they're after. And there are experts in Australia who know the region extremely well.
Yeah.
And I have met experts from China, from think tanks connected to the government, who confirm their goal is a military base in Polynesia, in Melanesia. If they could get one in the Northern Marianas and our patch, they'd be really happy, but that'll be harder. So it's game on, no doubt about it.
And Mike, can I add one other part to that? I mean, you're talking about, so the 2-dimensional, there's a 3-dimensional part of this, which is that they control a lot of overflight, a lot of space. And as you're looking at things that are happening in the atmosphere, but even in the high atmosphere, in space, these are incredibly important areas to control. And so you're talking about going underwater, you're talking about on the surface, and then you're also talking about space as things loop through in orbit. They go over the Pacific. And these are areas that are really hard to control.
That's a really important point. And the undersea, of course, the cables in particular, but submarine warfare.
The cables and the mining. Yeah.
Yeah. And the mining.
It's not, we have a tendency when we look back at history to think about it very two-dimensionally.
Yeah.
That it's a surface that you have to cover, a stepping stone or a road or something, but it's actually much more of a web or a network.
On a podcast called The Asia Chessboard, bringing in 3D chess, extra points for Ambassador Laura Stone.
There you go. I'm here to help.
The getting private investment, that is just vexing. It's vexing for Australia and Melanesia. It's vexing for New Zealand, for the US, for the French, who have the biggest EEZ. We should probably talk about that. But in the Australian case, we had some success. Maybe you could tell us more. Telstra, the telecom authority here, and Qantas have, because they're regulated industries, they're responsive to government, and the Australian government's convinced them to keep routes open, to help with telecom. The Australian bankers help with the banking system, which we haven't discussed, which is also very vulnerable to interference. But it's hard. I've talked to fund managers who focus on the Pacific, on the what we in America call the Pacific, meaning Asia Pacific, and they say they just don't see the return on investment. So we have Development Finance Corporation, but there's supposed to be a return on that investment. So is there a silver bullet? How do we get, yes, we need more private sector investment, but we are still market-based.
Yep.
How do you do it?
So we're market-based, but we're also very adept at pushing investment into areas that are very difficult. We just haven't figured out how to do it in a place we haven't invaded. So the United States was supporting investment in Afghanistan when Afghanistan was falling apart. It was supporting direct investment coming into Iraq. We do have the capability of putting our thumb on the scale and making it profitable. The United States has to come in very heavily and decide that it's important and has to be willing to, while still supporting private sector, making it make sense. And if they can do that, everybody would much rather have the private sector doing it than the government. As it is, the government does provide a tremendous amount of support to the region. It was very destabilizing last year when the COFA support was put on pause. So that and the continuing drama about whether birthright citizens will apply to the COFA countries who are in the United States without a visa. So technically they've said that they are not eligible for birthright citizenship, even though they're not there illegally. They're there perfectly legally. So these were very destabilizing to the relationships. But the COFA assistance has been restored. It just reminded everybody that they're very, very dependent on the United States. And for COFA countries that really have made their bed with the United States and really are committed to that relationship, it was, I think, a shock. But we have done the right thing. We have come back in and fixed it. But for the private investment, yeah, it's hard. It needs government assistance. The reason Qantas has been able to come in and, for example, supporting Air Nauru is because there are subsidies provided. The issue with this is that they're not really that expensive. I mean, when we're talking about the greater scheme of things, we are not talking about the cost of even a U.S. warship. These are really pretty inexpensive efforts, but they can't be expected to just let the free market create private investment. It's just not going to exist. The private investment that is somewhat viable comes from China. So if you want to seed it, you can.
Yeah, exactly. You can seed it. The other big example, probably the biggest example for the U.S. is Google and undersea cables.
Yeah.
Which went to, it was a Palau, I think.
They go through the whole area, including Marshall Islands. So
it's strategically important.
And then they're putting spurs down to the others. The connectivity, because we talked about this, the connectivity is so important for these areas. They're just so distant and so remote. They really, really need this connectivity. And they can't have private investment without it. So it's been great. The United States and the other countries, partners, have come in and really supported that and support it with just straight up subsidies because they realize that if they don't provide it, China will.
But also, am I right that it also is a critical piece of the overall Trans-Pacific and North-South Australia to Japan undersea cable network too? It's not, there's some self-interest in it as well, I think.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, and, there's an important base there that kind of needs some connectivity.
Yes, indeed. So public-private partnerships and the Google, the State Department, JBIC in Japan, Qantas and Dell, we kind of know how to do it. when there's a clear national security interest, when there's a larger infrastructure or telecom interest for the private sector. Are there other things like that, undersea mining, fishing, space monitoring, where you could get a KKR or a BlackRock and say, you know what, it's a long-term investment, but there's a lot of value here because it's the near-term return on investment that nobody sees. But is there a longer-term story to tell?
Possibly. I mean, there's the main resources there are undersea mining and fishing. And the fishing, there's the tuna treaty, which does subsidize the fishing. But what we need are docks. And the docks, the Chinese are much more willing to come in and invest in a dock. The docks are, again, we're not talking a lot of money here. We're talking 15 million, 20 million to create a processing environment that would squeeze out the Chinese. But it does require DFC to come in and take a pretty serious risk and to deal with an environment in which they don't have the normal Western standard accounting. There's a lot of concern about governance. You can find a million reasons to not do this stuff. And some of it will fail. But you have to just decide it's strategically important to not have major docks and docking facilities and ports controlled by China throughout the Pacific.
I know for Indo-Pacific, for the Indo-Pacific Command, they are focused on this like a laser. And they're an important part of the input to the national security process. And then you sometimes have senior diplomats. I'm told the Deputy Secretary now, Landau, is actually very interested in the Pacific, which is good. Kurt Campbell was in the Biden administration, of course, and by extension, Jake Sullivan and the Secretary of State and so forth. In the Bush administration, it was kind of me because of the COFA, but I managed to convince President Bush to do a Pacific Island Summit in Hawaii en route to Asia once. And he spent a half a day. And the last person to do it was his dad, something like 10 years earlier. So it's not a lot of resources. It only takes a couple senior officials to sort of champion this, and you can have a big effect. But boy, if we seed the field, the consequences are massive.
So we do manage to get some visitors. Deputy Secretary Landau has actually been great. Kurt Campbell was wonderful before that. It's much easier, obviously, when you get all the Pacific leaders together at one of the big forums that they have. So, because it takes forever to get around the Pacific. Again, this is the tyranny of distance. There really is just a very hard time. And I think, getting from one to another, it takes days and you got to switch out aircraft and things like that. But, really simple things like, inviting them to Washington or taking the time to go to their meetings, things like that. You really can get a lot of bang for that. But I really do believe that you need to show a little bit behind the diplomatic engagement. And I'm talking a little less about the COFA states. The COFA states, I really do feel like we put our money where our mouth is. We could do some really easy things with some of the support for investment. Indo-PACOM has done much better with trying to create these strategic bases. And they're not full bases, they're facilities. So They really are trying to put investment in, but we need things like DFC. USAID obviously doesn't exist anymore, but the State Department does still have some resources to do these small but incredibly important investments in very specific strategic areas. So do it in ports, do it in the telecommunications, just to keep the Chinese backbone out of the markets. And certain amount, the tourism is great, but the tourism can't exist in a lot of the places without the connectivity. So you really need flights.
Yep.
And they just don't have the flights. The Australians have done a little bit. United Airlines still flies across the northern tier, but it needs much more connectivity, and the connectivity is just never going to make sense market-wise. It's always going to be subsidized.
I am told, maybe you're following this as well, that despite the demise of USAID, the East Asia Bureau and other regional bureaus now have access to more development assistance funding than they ever have for strategic sort of targeted work, which is not, a lot of traditional development experts would say that's not how you're supposed to do it. But for what we're talking about, that might come in pretty handy in the years ahead.
Yeah. I mean, we have an organization that's supposed to do it. DFC is supposed to do this.
The finance
Yeah. They just haven't managed to been able to stomach the Pacific environment. And I mean that both literally and metaphorically. The actual environment there, you're talking about doing investments in areas that are very hard climatically.
Yeah.
climactically. I'm not sure what the right word is. It's just a very harsh
And they
environment.
get wiped out. Investments get wiped out.
Yeah, no, literally. Yeah.
By the weather. Yeah. Yeah.
And the other part of it is that these are fairly low governance states. And so you have to be really
Yeah.
careful about corruption.
Yes. But that is exactly why we need to be paying attention, because what our Australian friends call elite capture happens. With endemic corruption, you are creating a permissive environment for your adversaries to change the chessboard to get.
And it's really easy. It's a cheap buy, frankly.
Yeah.
As we look at the geostrategic importance, one of the areas the United States has always recognized with the Pacific Islands is that they're also very important in international organizations. And so when you talk about a country like China competing in the international space as well, and being able to get votes in the UN for undermining objectives of the United States or its partners, Australia, Japan, South Korea, you really do have to look at those vote blocks. And if you do have that elite capture, that's a lot of elites that they can capture pretty quickly.
Yeah. Good transition to multilateralism. And you mentioned the Pacific Island Forum, the PIF, earlier. And, it's a real diplomatic knife fight there. As you said, the Solomon Islands came under pressure from China, which is to not include Taiwan, even though 3 of the PIF members diplomatically recognize Taiwan. And so Australia and New Zealand are members, but we're observers. And so nobody got to come except the members. The next 2 years, I think the PIF is being hosted by friendlier states. It's Palau, Marshall Islands, I think, or what's
it's Palau, and then I don't know who's the next after Palau.
Yeah. So Solomon Islands is under particular. They're divided internally, which is exactly what Beijing loves, and so quite vulnerable to that interference. So we're in a better place. But I'm watching the whole PIF thing, and clearly part of our strategy, the U.S., Australia, New Zealand, I assume the French, the Brits, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, is to use the PIF, to use this and have, as much as possible, the policing of the diplomacy and the buffering against foreign interference be done by Fiji and the larger countries in the PIF, which is a smart strategy, except when you recall that was our strategy for ASEAN. And in 2016, China broke it because ASEAN depends on consensus. Mm-hmm. And without going through the whole history, the Philippines beat China in the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. ASEAN was getting ready to put out a statement saying you've got to deal with the Philippines on behalf of their member state, and they couldn't get it passed because of Chinese elite capture, frankly, in Cambodia and Laos and Myanmar. So this multilateralism, it's a good play, but I wonder, is the PIF, are we setting ourselves up for failure, or how do you assess it? Because the ASEAN, we still do ASEAN centrality. We all take ASEAN seriously, but boy, that was a deflating experience for the other powers when you realize how easy it is to basically neuter these regional multilateral organizations if you have money and influence. And are we setting ourselves up for failure with the PIF, or do you think we've got a good play on this?
Yeah, I don't think the PIF has quite the same dynamic.
Right.
In part because China doesn't have quite the same vested interest as it had in the South China Sea decisions. So it's been a little bit of a different scope. If it becomes that kind of issue, I think maybe the mistake that should not be repeated is expecting a consensus-based regional organization to solve our problems for us. I still think it's a great idea to strengthen them, but they're there to bulk up rather than find ways to a solution. They're better on the defense than the offense.
Yep.
And so to the extent that we haven't laden PIF with expecting it to solve problems that we don't really want to take too much of a direct hand in, I think PIF is still very much an entity that works for the Pacific Island countries. And so it's not been as problematic in that sense. China is still very much seeking to undermine it. And the fact that the Solomons were the host last year caused a diplomatic rift. But they did find a way forward. There's also the MIF, the Micronesian Island Forum. And that also gets a little bit of a U.S.-China mix going on because China does put an enormous amount of pressure on the Taiwan recognizing countries within the Micronesian Island Forum to allow more Chinese investment and allow a lot more Chinese assistance. But So far, we've managed to kind of push back on that. I guess it's not really the international organization's fault. It's that it's become a space for China to encroach on the interests of the United States and its partners. And it's just reflective in the international organizations.
Yeah. My question earlier was provocative, but I think we're smart to invest diplomatic effort, engagement into the PIF. It's a regional lead on setting norms and standards, including, by the way, in the PIF charter and the PIF secretariat, good governance and democracy. There's a lot there to work with. But you're right. These multilateral regional groupings are not always great at going on offense, but they're really important for step-by-step setting norms and standards.
Yeah.
Having a regional lead on preventing undue foreign interference and the rest. And defensively, we always have to keep careful. You'll recall Sean Fizz and the other Soviet successes getting ASEAN to declare various nuclear weapons free zones and so on and so forth meant, not out of Soviet idealism, but meant to obstruct the U.S. Navy. So we always have to be careful about these organizations being used against us, which in the case of the PIF is not an issue, I suspect, but someday. So we really need to be engaged.
So we do have some issues, and they're related to these nuclear legacies.
Yeah.
That do pop up in the PIF and in other international fora that are focused on the Pacific Islands. So questions about nuclear free zones and things like that, and what does that actually mean? We have to be really careful about how that proceeds. But a lot of that's an education process, actually, to make sure that the treaties and the understandings that they come to are ones that still, frankly, maintain their own interest in the United States and its partners being able to transit freely through the region.
It's an education process, and therefore it's a battlefield because disinformation on the other side can be effective.
Exactly.
It has been in some of the PIF countries. It's also a bit of a negotiating ploy, I found, for the Marshallese and others to keep pressure on us because we provide funding still, don't we? We did when I was in government because of the Bikini Atoll tests, as do the French and others. So I think probably a bit of keeping this issue alive also helps the negotiating position about how much money we provide. Maybe that's not true anymore. Was for a long time.
No, I mean, it's definitely true that it comes up in the negotiation. I'm not entirely sure how much of it's ploy and how much of it's deeply held belief. There's really a fundamental view that these, and it plays out in the United States as well in the quote unquote downwinders. Mm-hmm. So native communities that were downwind of the tests. And it was this idea that certain people were considered in the 50s and 60s when they were doing the testing as more disposable. And so this is I think a fundamental point when you're talking about the Pacific Island. These are sovereign states. These are people that at times have been treated poorly through history or through colonization. And you really do need to come in with all due respect. And so sometimes when we talk about them as important chess pieces or things like that, you have to remember that from their perspective, they are very much proud, sovereign people that have managed to maintain not only a culture, but communities in some of the harshest places on the face of the earth. And I think it's really important to lead with that as well.
Well, that's a good point. And I've said on this podcast and elsewhere that if we're on the side of sovereignty and national strengthening, we win. But if we're looking at them as pawns or objects of American competition with China, we won't win.
Exactly.
So maybe take a minute to tell us what in the Marshall Islands and elsewhere, what is the national vision? Is it about human security? When I was at CSIS, we tried to do surveys of thought leaders in the Pacific Islands. It was hard to get a big sample, but things like climate came up quite strongly. Infrastructure, sovereignty. What on the ground are the issues that, where in Majuro and elsewhere they were looking for American help to fulfill their national objectives? Yeah.
So U.S. and other developed countries helped, so including China. I mean, their national vision is survival. It's until you've been there, it's hard to get a grip on just how hard and how impressive it is that these peoples have survived in these environments for 1,000 years or more. They are just constantly battered by the environment. And the United States turning away from climate change has really been problematic because for the islands, climate isn't an abstract. It's not whether or not you're going to have to run your air conditioning a little hotter. It causes storms that could wipe out communities, could wipe out islands, could wipe out nations. And so for them, they want seawalls, they want, investment, they want more secure environment. They are all dealing with depopulation. It's a really existential threat. But almost everything I talk about when I'm talking about their future is literally whether or not 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, their nation will exist.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's the full suite of climate issues, but especially adaptation, which should not be ideological. You don't need to debate COP projections to see that you need seawalls and infrastructure support and resilience. It really shouldn't be ideological.
It's true. But it's not just climate. It's also the economic development. I mean, will there still be Marshallese in the Marshall Islands? Or will it all be Filipinos and Chinese? It's really everything gets down to, can these small communities and these small nations continue to survive?
How broadly is that true? I mean, I assume that's less true in Fiji or PNG, but would be a similar story in Vanuatu or,
PNG is quite different, although climate and depopulation are still really important issues, and economic development. So it's not completely untrue, but it's more acute for the smaller countries.
Well, part of being a diplomat, by the way, is not just dealing with the host country, but dealing with our allies. Sometimes that part's harder. And for Australia and New Zealand, this is a core diplomatic front. And as Foreign Minister Penny Wong has grown the Pacific branch of DFAT, but I think it's actually larger in terms of personnel than all the major powers combined. So it's that important for Australia and obviously for New Zealand. We are a bit more episodic. I think that drives our allies a bit crazy. I sometimes sense they're never happy. They're happy when we're not there. And then when we show up, they're unhappy that we want to go in and fix everything. What was it like working on the ground? Of course, Marshall Islands is so connected to the U.S., maybe it'd be different from the Solomons or Vanuatu. But how do you think we're doing with allies and partners? Because everything we've just described is maybe in the COFA states, but across the whole region, this is a multiplayer game. We need Australia, Japan, France, New Zealand, UK. How are the diplomatic relations with our allies on the ground?
So in theory, great. I mean, just wonderful. There's no tension. There's no sniping. Everybody's just trying to dig in and lift up what they can. However, it's pretty uncoordinated. And if I was going to wave a magic wand and create one really easy, cheap thing that I could do, is somehow force all of the partners to create a Pacific envoy that's responsible for the region, that has a little bit of staff, that's basically just in charge of coordinating stuff with the Pacific Island countries and with the other partners. And just they meet regularly, even phone calls, and just are responsible for just coordinating the stuff so that everybody isn't recreating it every time you come to a new port or something like that.
Sort of like how in the Obama administration, the U.S. and others established ambassadors to ASEAN.
Yeah, very similar.
Based in Jakarta. You could probably also do that without the required legislation or State Department decision-making by having a assistant secretary or even DAS level coordination mechanism with partners that had a regular rhythm. And I always imagine a matrix of what the problems are where and who's attentive to them and comparing notes and a bit more structure. I think that's a bit episodic. It depends on when officials travel and things like that rather than a regular rhythm.
We have tried to create a Pacific envoy in the past, or an envoy to the PIF or things like that. But it has to be somebody that's really got just the minimal resources to travel, to the willingness. It can't be somebody that is just looking for a title and maybe an occasional drop into Fiji and Palau. They have to be really committed to the region. They have to be based in the region, and they have to have counterparts. The only reason things like a DAS don't work is because the distances are too big. Right. So a DAS who does anything else can't spend the time you need to just physically get around the place.
So you almost need someone in Suva or somewhere. I guess Suva would make sense.
Hawaii is fine, or something.
Yeah. Good thought. All right.
But maybe you need to have a counterpart. So Australia should have one. New Zealand should have one. The United States should have one. South Korea should have one. South Korea needs to be more involved, and Japan should have one. Taiwan should have one. I think Taiwan does have one, actually.
France, UK?
Sure, France, UK, like everybody. Yeah. It's just one person.
Good thought. Maybe some congressional staff are listening to this. We'll get excited and we'll see legislation. Laura Stone, thanks. As a taxpayer, thank you for your service on the front lines of diplomacy and the even harder front lines of Washington, D.C. And good luck in Stanford. This has been a really terrific discussion. Thanks.
It's been wonderful. And hope to see you in Palau next year.
Did you say Palau or Palo Alto?
Yeah, Palau. Come on. Everybody should join in the PIF.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.